Armbands, a 2-inch piece of black cloth. It may seem simple, but wearing this small article was a substantial act of courage and launched a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. When 3 students from Des Moines, Iowa wore armbands in defiance of the school rules, they started a chain of events that would hold lasting precedent. Their actions meant taking a stand against the school administrators, and their protest would bring about one of the biggest changes to American public school policy in history. The year was 1965. 184,000 American soldiers were stationed in Vietnam, and Operation Rolling Thunder was underway. The Voting Rights Act was signed into law by President Johnson. Malcolm X had just been assassinated. A wave of protests were sweeping across the nation. Senator Robert F. Kennedy proposed a permanent end to hostilities in Vietnam, starting with an extension of the Christmas truce. However, at that time, the war was widely supported across the country, so Senator Kennedy's proposal gained little ground. A peaceful end to the war was not in sight. Inspired by Kennedy's proposal, 3 students, Mary Beth Tinker, John Tinker, and Christopher Eckhart, hatched a plan to publicly campaign against the Vietnam War and mourn the dead. In a move of solidarity, the group decided to wear black armbands at school during the Christmas truce.
For one thing, we've been taught all our lives, as kids are, that peace is the way.
We grew up learning to be sympathetic to people who were suffering. And during the war, of course, lots of people suffered.
Ross Peterson, a fellow student in the Des Moines School District, wrote a newspaper article describing the students' impending stand for peace in Vietnam. The school administration, upon reading the article and believing that politics had no place in an institution for learning, publicly announced that any student wearing a black armband would be suspended.
They were nervous about controversy in the schools, the school district, the principals. And you see, they didn't mind students, expressing themselves with symbolic speech, as long as it was something they agreed with.
Despite this change in school policy, Mary Beth Tinker and Christopher Eckhart took a stand against the school administration and wore their armbands to school on December 16th. Upon entering his school, Eckhart went directly to the office, knowing he would be punished. However, Mary Beth went through the school day without disruption until she was sent to the office by a teacher after lunch. Tinker and Eckhart were suspended that day and sent home. The next day, John Tinker wore an armband to his school and was suspended as well. In a school board meeting in January, the Tinkers argued their case, but the suspension was upheld, leaving them no choice but to continue their fight. Led by American Civil Liberties Union attorney Dan Johnston, the Tinkers continued to defend their stand in federal district court, where their claim was dismissed as the court believed that the school had acted within its authority to prevent a disruption. When the Tinkers appealed the decision, the court was divided, meaning that the district court's ruling was upheld. Eventually, there was only one authority left to turn to, the Supreme Court. Led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, this court issued some of the most liberal and groundbreaking decisions of the 20th century. Oral arguments took place on November 11, 1968. The Tinkers and Eckhart's stand for their rights was now being put to the ultimate test. Justice Thurgood Marshall was particularly sympathetic to the Tinkers' case, shown through his fierce arguments against the school's attorney, Alan Herrick.
A former student of one of our high schools was killed in Vietnam. Some of his friends are still in school. It was felt that if any kind of a demonstration existed, it might evolve into something which would be difficult to control.
Do we have a city in this country that hasn't had someone killed in Vietnam?
No, I think not, Your Honor. There are 18.
How many were wearing armbands?
Well, there were 5 suspended for wearing armbands.
Well, were any wearing armbands who were not suspended?
Yes, I think there were 2.
That makes 7.
They weren't accepted, and I'll refer to that a little later. They were
7 out of 18,000. And the school board was afraid that 7 students wearing armband would disrupt 18,000.
However, it did look like the Tinkers' case was under threat when Justice White questioned their legal position.
Why did they wear the armband in the class? To express that message?
To express the message, yes.
To everybody in the class?
To everyone in the class, yes.
And everybody, while they were listening to some other subject matter, was supposed to also be looking at the armband and taking in that message?
Well, to the extent that they would see it, but I don't believe there was any, I don't believe that the...
Well, it wasn't, they were intended to see it, weren't they?
They were intended to see it in a way that would not
and
be
to
distracting.
understand it.
And to understand it,
and
yes,
to
Your
absorb
Honor.
that message.
And to absorb the message.
While they're studying arithmetic or mathematics, they're supposed to be taking in this message about Vietnam.
Well, except that, Your Honor, I believe that the method that the students chose in this particular instance was specifically designed in such a way that it would not cause that kind of disruption.
When oral arguments had finished, there was only one thing left to wait for: the decision. The moment of truth was February 24, 1969. The Supreme Court sided with the Tinkers in a ruling of 7-2. Justice Abe Fortas wrote the opinion, where he stated, "It can hardly be argued that either students or teachers shed their constitutional right to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate." He further defended the Tinkers by saying, "The school officials banned and sought to punish the Tinkers and Eckhart for a silent, passive expression of opinion, unaccompanied by any disorder or disturbance on their part." He continues saying, "Any word spoken in class, in the lunchroom, or on campus that deviates from the views of another person may start an argument or cause a disturbance, but our Constitution says we must take this risk." This ruling set the baseline across the country, known as the Tinker Standard. Any regulation limiting the free speech of a student must exist only because the speech would materially and substantially interfere with the work of the school.
It said very strongly that schools should not be enclaves of totalitarianism.
The Tinker Standard says that unless student speech causes a material or substantial disruption to the educational process of the school, or invades the rights of others, then student free speech must be allowed.
While student free speech rights were expanded by Tinker, the Supreme Court has since curbed school speech. In the case of Hazelwood v. Kuhlmeyer, the court gave school administrators what amounts to editorial control over student newspapers. Additionally, the court has given school officials the ability to limit student speech based on its content in cases like Bethel v. Frazier, which limited speech considered profane, and Morse v. Frederick, which limited speech that promoted illegal drug use.
The Tinker decision was the high point, and everything has been backtracking from it.
Since the Tinker case was decided, U.S. Supreme Court cases cut back on student free speech and carved out exceptions to the Tinker Standard that are not very good.
Tinker was in the 1960s, and since then we've had this line of cases that shrink student protection under the First Amendment.
Student speech has also faced threats from recent laws regarding student speech outside of school. School administrators have tried to regulate what students can say on the internet through social media. Now, a student can be punished regardless of whether or not those words were said within the schoolhouse gates. However, many positive changes have emerged as well. Following the Tinker case, several states passed even more liberal reforms extending students' free speech rights in school. In 1972, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts pioneered these laws with the Student Free Expression Act. Since then, similar student free expression laws have been passed in states across the country. The Tinkers won their case, taking a stand not just for themselves, but for students across the nation. The Tinker Standard continues to be lasting precedent cited in cases nationwide every year. It revolutionized school policy, because it guaranteed that students cannot be punished simply because the school doesn't like what they have to say, but instead because the school can show that the speech would cause a major disruption to the learning process. It said in no uncertain terms that students can take a stand to express their political views, and they do have free speech rights in school.
It helped to level the playing field between students and administrators. So I think it was a step forward for respect for young people and respect for youth voices.
Tinker gives students and teachers in public schools protection for when they do take a stand.
Mary Beth Tinker, far from undermining the educational process, was actually contributing to it when she wore the black armband and invited discussion about the Vietnam War.
Taking a stand is the quintessential tenet behind the First Amendment. Taking a stand is about doing what one feels is morally right despite the consequences. The Tinkers and Eckhart are one of the prime examples of taking a stand in U.S. history. They took a stand against the Vietnam War. They took a stand against the school administrators by wearing armbands despite the rule. But they also took a stand for their First Amendment rights, and their case has led to greater ability for students to take a stand since.
Come gather round, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink